All right, and we should be live now.
Hi, everyone. We're going to start at, in about 3 or 4 minutes. Hi, everyone. We're going to start in about 1 minute. Okay, well, let's get started. My name is Radley Horton, one of the co-organizers for this conference. And I'm really excited today to be moderating this panel on regional perspectives on US relocation and migration. This is a special session in a sense, in that all the speakers are part of NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments program. And I think what I'll do before introducing our 4 speakers who represent four of these regions in the RISA program, quickly put up a couple slides just to give a little background on this program and show a little bit about why RISAs, I think, are very well situated as we think about complex issues that require strong stakeholder perspectives, strong interdisciplinarity, and that are inherently very complex. This will just take a minute or two. Okay, so what is NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments program? Can everybody see my slides, by the way? See my screen? Should probably put it into slideshow. I get a thumbs up. Anybody see it? Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, so RISAs help build the knowledge, expertise, and ability to plan and prepare for climate variability and change. Some of the key aspects are regional relevance combined with local expertise, engaging with various types of communities, stakeholders. It's an integrated approach to science based on the premise that outside experts can add certain value, but it's really when we engage with local populations and think about the decision context and the values that are in play as they're thinking about all the types of decisions they make. We try to find ways for climate science and other types of information, social science, to engage communities where they're working and where they're acting. This can also be referred to as a knowledge to action partnership, and it really is a national network focused on resilience and adaptation, where we work together, as we'll hear today, on complex issues that span multiple regions. And we really have different approaches to this process of engaging. So I've benefited greatly from learning from the perspective and experience of some of the RISA folks who you're going to hear from throughout this session. Okay, and then the entire nation is not covered by the RISA program, but you can see here the parts that are. Our hope is that NOAA will be looking to expand the program to cover more of the country. And as you'll hear today, I think it really is a special program that can help contribute, as I say, to complex and urgent societal issues. Okay, so with that, we can move into the discussion. I'll quickly introduce the four speakers. We're kind of going to be moving west to east. The first RISA that we'll hear from is the Pacific RISA. It's represented by their lead, Victoria Keener. I'll stop the screen share here. Excuse me for a second. Okay, great. Then from there, we're going to hear from Alaska, Danielle Meeker, the Sustained Assessment Specialist at Alaska's Center for Climate Assessment and Policy. Then we'll go to Maria Carmen Lemos, the co-director of the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment Program. And finally, representing the RISA that I'm part of, Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, Malgosia Matajewicz, an associate research scientist at Columbia University's Center for Climate Systems Research. Okay, so each of those four speakers are going to talk for about 12 minutes. That should leave us close to a half hour for discussion, and we really encourage you all in the audience to pose questions throughout. So with that, very excited. One thing I really need to say is special thanks to Anna Lopresti, who is the brainchild behind this session and really helped with all aspects of organization and coming up with the sort of key conceptual themes, working with the folks that you'll hear from today. So special thanks to Anna for that. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to you, Vicki, to give us our first presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Radley. And let me just do the screen sharing dance here. Okay, is everybody seeing the correct screen? Looks good, okay. Yes. It's always great when you start giving a talk and it's looking at your notes or your web browser or something. Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for this invitation, and I'm happy to be here with my RISA colleagues today. My name is Victoria Keener. I'm a senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is a nonprofit research and education center. I'm also a co-lead PI of the Pacific Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. The other co-lead, Laura Brewington, is on here with me today so we can tag team with questions. And like the rest of the RISAs, we do sustained work with different stakeholder groups on climate research to help inform policy and management. So I'm really happy to be on this panel today, representing our region with the other RISAs, sharing stories and thinking about lessons of climate resilience and relocation. So just as a little introduction, we are, one of the unique things about this panel is that we do span quite a large expanse of the globe. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our region that we cover. Here's the geographical scope. For these purposes, I'm going to concentrate on Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands. So altogether, that's comprised of the state of Hawaii, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of Palau, territories of Guam, and American Samoa. So kind of looking overall, issues of equity in that region start with the vastness and the diverse geographies, the varied governance structures and socioeconomic conditions, the presence of the US military, and the climate data monitoring and modeling programs that are available. So I'm going to speak about two examples in our region today, one from the Republic of the Marshall Islands and one in Hawaii. But as you can see from some of these statistics, the islands like to say that we are not small island state, we're large ocean states. And so we have this varied governance in the region, a colonial history, a very large range in GDP per capita, ranging from $3,400 to average of 51,000 in Hawaii, and a lot of different military bases and installations throughout the region. So I also wanted to, for the sake of equity, give a little background on the Compact of Free Association. So there are meaningful differences in how US states, territories, and freely associated states are treated. While Compact of Free Association states, while territories do receive US federal funding, they're not eligible for international climate aid programs, such as the Green Climate Fund, and they're unable to officially participate in UN scale small islands advocacy organizations. So several of these sovereign islands are in alignment with the US through the Compact of Free Association, or the COFA, which dates back to the Reagan administration. And so this is the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. So this provides billions of dollars in aid for defense rights to the exclusive economic zones of these countries, and also to pay back for past colonial and nuclear injustices that were carried out in the region. Many of the COFA countries are located in the North Pacific, which are systematically less represented in regional governing councils that address climate issues. And just of interest, the current COFA will expire in the next few years and will be renegotiated. So I'm going to talk first about a case study in a COFA state, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. And this is a project that the Pacific RISA did. It was led by Kees Vandergeest, Maxine Burkett, Juno Fitzpatrick, Mark Steggy, and Brittany Wheeler. And the main organizations working with us were the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center and the Environmental Law Program at the University of Hawaii. Here's a map of the Marshall Islands. It's a series of atolls in the Pacific. They're one of the lowest lying island nation states in the world. They're acutely vulnerable to sea level rise, flooding, and the associated intrusion of salt water into freshwater supplies. Persistent drought also affects their agricultural production and access to drinking water. So within the Marshalls, there are substantial migration flows between islands, and particularly from outer islands to the capital, Madro, which is indicated by that star there. Also Ebi and the US military base Kwajalein, which you may have heard of. In addition, many are migrating to other countries, particularly the United States, and the number of Marshallese residing in the US has rapidly risen over the past couple decades. So our questions were really to look at to what extent climate with stressors were driving migration, what the impacts of the migration was on the migrants and their communities, and what shared views they had. And we did a couple of different methods, including household surveys, focus group, Q methodology, and spatial analysis. So the factors triggering human migration are complex and intertwined, which makes it difficult to pinpoint and address specific causes. For example, this World Health Organization report laid out climate and health-related concerns in the RMI. El Nino-induced drought is especially negatively linked to direct and indirect health impacts in the RMI. And Laura Brewington on this call is leading another project looking specifically at climate and health. Oops. So findings of this, I'm just going to skip ahead to the findings of this project, looking at the environmental causes of migration, looked at destinations in Hawaii and the US Pacific Northwest. And there are about 300 households that were surveyed across 3 atolls in the Marshalls, and an additional 80 people in destination locations. So the first finding was that education, healthcare, and jobs were definitely the main drivers of migration. However, 42% of people said environmental factors influenced their decision to leave. And the leading climate impact driving people to leave was drought, which impacted more than 90% of households over the last 5 years. Now, this is somewhat of a surprising finding, since much of the international media around climate threats to the Marshalls focuses heavily on sea level rise. But interestingly, for Marshallese who had already migrated, sea level rise was identified as the main reason they were planning on not returning with their families to the islands. And then I'll also point out this website, rmi-migration.com, where all of the findings and papers that came out of this project are published in much greater detail. The second case study that I just wanted to go over is more of a rapidly evolving case study looking at recent extreme rainfall and flooding in Hawaii. So I'm going to go over some recent events, impacts, and trends. So we've been seeing a possible increasing incidence of these microburst, or colloquially called rain bomb events. The most recent was in March 2021 and affected the islands of Kauai, Oahu, and Maui. There were major landslides on Kauai. You can see at this top photo, which closed access to the North Shore, the one Northern Highway. There were evacuations and flooding on Oahu's North Shore. A dam was breached on Maui. And there were rescues and power outages across the islands, including water conservation measures. Previously, one that got a lot of attention was an April 2018 microburst, which actually set a new 24-hour rainfall record of 49 inches in 24 hours. And over 530 properties were damaged, highway access was severed, and there was quite a bit of damage to both public and private property. However, what we are starting to see through all of this is that strong and systematic community and county responses saved lives. So all these different types of evacuations, this actually shows a bison rescue. So people and animals. The North Shore of Kauai actually developed a database of impacted families and elders and did regular community check-ins to make sure that everyone was getting what they needed. The community also led cleanups and supply ferries by both boat and helicopter. And what they really were showing was that a successful organic response can grow into a systemic long-term plan. And there's a larger story about that recovery and impact on that Sea Grant site. Lastly, I wanted to quickly mention the city and county of Honolulu's Ola Oahu Resilience Strategy, which kind of outlined these 4 areas of resilience for the island. So long-term affordability, resilience in the face of natural disasters, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and leveraging the leadership of communities. And this last one, leveraging the leadership of communities, I think is very relevant for when we talk about transferable strategies, when we look at community resilience in the face of these different potential migration or movement of people. So in terms of needs for regional integrated relocation planning, that figure on the right shows decrease in stream gauges in Hawaii and all the other Pacific islands from 1910 to 2010. So we have less data available now and then historically throughout the region, which inherently creates this unequal opportunity for research and adaptation and climate science. Some other best practices would be to include local organizations and governments as equal partners in the design and response to events, to learn from the communities and communicate through appropriate groups, whether that's translating information into another language or from scientific jargon, to maintain sustained and transparent engagement with these communities, and to provide resources that are, I already mentioned that one, appropriately translated. And finally, some things that I would just like to pose to the group include, does community coherence contribute to a higher climate resilience in general? And is that something that we can look at across regions? Also, the idea that traditional cost benefit analysis doesn't adequately encompass the value of lives saved and avoided costs with adaptation and mitigation strategies, and that a combination of incentives and policy levers should be used to facilitate a more equitable adaptation or relocation approach. Finally, some work that we've done on Oahu with the Honolulu Climate Commission looks at alternative risk transfer methods for financial risk guidance for cities and communities. That could include things like cat bonds or parametric insurance, especially when multiple large storms are involved. Looking at the prevalence and increasing prevalence of heat events in the future, and using integrated planning frameworks and regional boundary organizations that are able to integrate these different interdepartmental or community organizations together, such as like in the One Water framework, which we're starting to implement in Hawaii. Finally, I will just leave that RMI migration website there for you in case you wanted to check it out, and pass it on to Alaska, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Vicki. Let's go, Danielle, if you're ready, take it away.
Sure. Let me share my screen. And is everyone seeing that okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Danielle Meeker, and I live on the traditional lands of the Occoquan and Takuquan Tlingit peoples in Juneau, Alaska. I am a researcher and sustained assessment specialist with the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, which is located at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. For my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about some of the climate impacts to infrastructure that we've seen in rural, predominantly indigenous and coastal communities in Alaska, as well as opportunities to better support those communities that are pursuing relocation, managed retreat, and protection in place. First, I'm going to give an overview of some of the unique contextual factors of Alaska's rural communities, which affects their vulnerability to climate change. Next, I'm going to be talking about some of the equity considerations that I think are critical in guiding not only managed retreat and relocation, but climate adaptation work in general in Alaska. Then I'm going to share some findings from past ACAP research regarding communities, climate information, and capacity building needs. And lastly, I'm going to discuss some relevant ACAP projects. Here are some key Alaska facts. First, we are geographically a very large state, roughly 1/5 the size of the lower 48. We also have more coastline than all of the lower 48 states combined. Alaska is home to 229 federally recognized tribes, which is over 1/3 of federally recognized tribes in the country. Alaska has 20 distinct indigenous language families, which are recognized as official state languages. Approximately 82% of Alaska communities are not on the road system, making them heavily reliant upon air and marine transportation for travel, as well as the shipment of fuel and supplies. The average resident of rural Alaska harvests 276 pounds of wild food per year, and this harvest of wild foods is a core component of the mixed cash subsistence economies that exist in most rural villages. Here are some climate impacts that are having the greatest effect on our rural coastal communities, from increased precipitation and rising air temperatures to sea level rise and the loss of barrier sea ice that protects the coast from storm surge and wave action. Altogether, these climate impacts are contributing to flooding, permafrost thaw, and coastal erosion, which are the most common and severe threats to community infrastructure and the greatest drivers of relocation and managed retreats. The Yupik word ushtek can be translated as surface caves in, and it describes a concurrence of permafrost thaw, flooding, and erosion. Ushtek generally manifests in one of two ways, either as a sloughing off of the coast, as is seen in this photo, or in the emergence of sinkholes. But either way, it is generally a sudden and complete destabilization of the land. Although over a dozen Alaska Native communities are pursuing managed retreat or relocation, I'm going to talk specifically about the community of Kivalina as an example. Kivalina is located in the Northwest Arctic borough, and the community itself is situated at the southern end of a barrier island or spit separating the Chukchi Sea on the left from a lagoon at the mouth of the Kivalina River on the right. The community itself was originally a seasonal camp until 1905, when the federal government built a school there and forced the community to settle. The area of the community is about a half-mile long and 800 feet wide, although that is changing due to erosion. And it is home to about 440 people, many of whom live in overcrowded conditions. Both sides of the spit experience chronic erosion and flooding, which are exacerbated from severe fall and winter storms. The community has been responding to these impacts since at least 1990, when they requested the assistance of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in putting sandbags around the island. You can see in this photo that those sandbags have been replaced with rock revetment walls. The community voted to relocate in 1992. They actually held earlier votes in 1953 and 1963, but 1992 is the first vote that passed. However, several of their preferred relocation sites have been deemed unsuitable or unsafe by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and subsequently rejected. The Army Corps of Engineers estimates that the total cost for this move will be between $100 to $400 million, so almost $1 million per person on the higher end. Because of the challenges that the community has encountered with relocating, they have pursued the near-term strategy of building a bridge across the Kivalina Lagoon and an evacuation road to an undeveloped site about 7 miles away that's on higher ground. They opened this bridge and road last fall after 3 years of planning and 2 years of construction, nearly 28 years after first voting to relocate. So I think that gives you a sense of how long communities have been pursuing this and some of the challenges they've faced. And I think this photo illustrates that simply retreating inland is not always an option for these communities, who instead have to entirely relocate. That photo at the bottom shows the Kivalina Bridge that was opened last year. And here are just a few selected events from the decades-long history of Alaska Native villages that have pursued relocation. In 1973, the village of Shishmara first voted to relocate, followed by Kivalina in 1992 and Newtok in 1996. I think it's important to note that none of these communities have fully relocated yet. In 1997, Shishmaref, which is located on an island, relocated 14 homes further inland after fall storms, which took out about 30 feet of shoreline. In 2003, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, reported that 86% of Alaska Native communities were affected by flooding or erosion. This report did not look at thawing permafrost. In 2007, 11 years after first voting to relocate, Newtok used BIA funds to build the first 3 homes in their relocation site of Mutavik, which is about 9 miles away. Those 3 homes are shown in the photo below. In 2009, GAO released a follow-up report which identified 31 Alaska Native villages as imminently threatened by flooding or erosion. In 2015, on his visit to Alaska, President Obama designated the Denali Commission as the lead agency for relocation in Alaska. However, this designation did not come with any additional funding. In 2019, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the University of Alaska Fairbanks released the statewide threat assessment, which estimated the threats of erosion, permafrost thaw, and flooding in 187 communities across the state. The report ranked each community based on its vulnerability to each threat, both individually and all together. The report authors measured the intensity of each impact in 9 different categories, which they called evaluation factors, including risk to critical infrastructure, risk to health and human safety, subsistence, and cultural importance. This figure on the right shows the ranking of communities for the combined threats, so erosion, flooding, and thawing permafrost all together. The communities in red were those rated as most vulnerable, while those in green were rated as least vulnerable. You can see that most of the communities in red and orange are on the west coast along the Bering Sea, which is also where we see the greatest occurrence of USHTEC. Here are some equity considerations that we at ACAP incorporate into our work with communities and which I think are important for guiding adaptation work in Alaska in general. First is the fact that many Alaska Native communities were forced by the federal government to settle in seasonal camps that were ill-suited for permanent settlement. This forced settlement constrained their mobility and their ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. And this is why you see communities such as Kivalina or Shishmaref on these spits or islands that are vulnerable to erosion and flooding. We also acknowledge that climate displacement threatens Indigenous peoples' physical ties and rights to land and resources, as well as their spiritual relationships with traditionally occupied places. Alaska Native peoples have been stewarding this land for over 10,000 years and are intrinsically tied to the land, which is why we recognize that relocation and managed retreat are more than just a physical move and more of an uprooting. We also account for the fact that the adaptive capacity that has allowed Alaska Natives to adapt to environmental change for millennia is constrained by institutional barriers, such as restrictive grant requirements and many federal regulations. And lastly, we believe that Indigenous knowledge is key to guiding adaptation efforts, and that the respectful exchange and use of Indigenous knowledge requires building relationships and instituting safeguards. Here we have some community needs in terms of climate information that have been identified in past ACAP research. The first is location-specific downscale data, as well as new monitoring and data collection projects, especially community-led monitoring that has a capacity building component. Communities are requesting baseline data on physical, ecological, and socioeconomic variables that allows them to better understand and document the changes that are occurring, as well as maps of flood and erosion risk, and the development of decision support tools to inform planning and policymaking. In addition to climate information needs, ACAP research has also revealed some needs related to the process of climate adaptation, specifically in terms of coordination and funding. There is a need for better coordination across and among academic institutions, agencies, and local governments, as well as increased funding, of course, local decision-making authority, and the upholding of tribal sovereignty, and the integration of local and Indigenous knowledges. Lastly, I'm just going to mention some ACAP projects relating to rural infrastructure, relocation, and managed retreat. ACAP has been collaborating with Louisiana State University on a multi-year project to better understand the impacts of climate change and extreme weather on rural water and wastewater infrastructure in Alaska and Louisiana. Researchers have been talking to water managers in both states to better understand their climate information needs and the networks that they use to access climate information. ACAP serves as the backbone organization for a recently formed climate adaptation community of practice. This community of practice is meant to convene regional adaptation practitioners or service providers and state and federal agencies to share updates, reduce duplication of efforts, improve coordination, and better support communities. And lastly, ACAP is a lead contributor to the upcoming 2023 report of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, which is a working group of the Arctic Council. The chapter that we are working on has to do with societal impacts, and we will be holding some listening sessions in Alaska this fall to inform that chapter. So thank you very much, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, let's go to MC.
Okay, let me see if I won't destroy our fantastic record of success with everything so far. Okay, sharing. All right. Can everybody see my screen? All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the presentations that preceded me, and a lot of I'm going to talk about has been talked by the other RISAs. So GLISA is represents the Midwest and the Great Lakes region. Officially, we are only Great Lakes, but in actually practice, we have the jurisdiction of 8 Great Lakes states plus the province of Ontario in Canada. So here is some quick information about GLISA. We work in very different sectors, but most acutely in agriculture, tribal issues, and cities. And we are 10 years out as of this year, and hoping to continue to serve the region for longer. So we are a little bit of the, I would say, the region, we are a little bit of the odd region in this group, because differently for the presentations that preceded this one, the focus on the Great Lakes is mixed. So we have both the pressure of cities that have experienced for the past 50 years processes of economic downturn and loss of manufacturing and population and aging infrastructure. And those processes are coupled with, of course, a slew of environmental justice problems that have plagued the region for many years and have become more acute in the past 10 years, both with disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on populations, such as the case of Flint and water contamination, as well as the recent disproportionate impact of COVID on minorities, especially Black and Latino populations in the Great Lakes region, and especially on what we call legacy cities, which were cities that have particularly been affected by economic downturn in the last 40 years. We also have, on the other side, been experiencing much more concerted and active engagement and activities and movements and social movements on these cities, protesting not only about racial inequality, but also about this lack of attention to environmental justice issues that have been plaguing the region for many, many years. The other way in which we are a little bit different than the other regions is that we are bracing ourselves for both migration from some parts of the Great Lakes to the coast, but also maybe immigration driven by climate change from other regions of the US. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of story of how this this new focus on immigration has been emerging for the past 10 years, more like 5 years, but I have heard about it for the past 10 years. So during the fourth National Climate Assessment, we held a series of stakeholder meetings. And one of those meetings in the city of Cincinnati, it was the first time that formally the issue of immigration was raised within the fourth assessment organization in the Great Lakes at the time. And the questions were like, if people are moving out from other parts of the US, where are they going? Is there a chance that they will come here? And if they are coming here, what should we be doing to attract people? So the conversation was in a tone of opportunity, trying to understand, if there were opportunities for the region to attract different migrants, but mostly economic migrants from other parts of the US. That conversation evolved then to a series of events, including a large article in the New York Times in 2018 in which cities like Duluth and Buffalo were featured, and again with a positive and opportunity-driven theme that they were interested in understanding, and attracting population movements to the region. What was not discussed in either of these opportunities is to what extent, this idea of the Great Lakes as an incoming geography or an incoming region would actually overlap with the problems that already exist. So, and also to what extent other issues that we know are going to emerge already happening, but will become more severe in the Great Lakes, are being taken into account on these conversations about attracting migrants to the region. So although the Great Lakes comparatively with other, relatively comparatively to other regions on the US is relatively mild in terms of the impacts of climate change, it's still a region that will be exposed to much more precipitation, much more temperature rise, and with mostly negative impacts, especially on agriculture in the region. And also another factor is that because of economic downturn, we have potentially the most expensive bill on infrastructure retrofitting because of climate change, which was a major focus of the Great Lakes, or of the Midwest chapter on the NCA4. So the discussion for us at GLISA has been, how we both look at this as a potential opportunity in which a lot of the cities that we serve and we have long-term relationships with are at least curious, and some of them very invested already to start this conversation. And at the same time, temper these expectations and raise different questions or raise questions that might be not as salient as the questions being raised by those that see this as an opportunity. So, the ability of those cities both to attract new people, new population, but also to account for the population that is already there, many times in situations that there are less than ideal, it is a big issue of discussion right now. So we are focusing specifically so for this project, we are focusing specifically in coastal cities because Although many of the large urban areas in the Great Lakes have shrunk in terms of population, coastal cities in the Great Lakes has actually increased population on average overall. And there is also a hypothesis that people who are looking for those climate amenities and also to access to water and beauty recreation might want to come to Great Lakes coastal cities as a choice when and if and when they leave other coasts in the U.S. because of sea level rise. So the other issue that is different in the Great Lakes is that lake levels variation is a unique process in which climate change is expected. So the role of climate change is still under a lot of research, but there is more and more consensus that the variation is going to increase, both very high highs and low lows, and how this vary and the time in between those variations. So we are just coming out of a period of extremely highs until 2019, and now entering in a low level phase, but still higher than previous 2018. So the conversation in a lot of the coastal communities is to what extent can you adapt to lakes that go up and down, and to what extent incoming people or maybe influx of population may make these situations even worse than they are right now. So currently, a lot of the Great Lakes coastal cities are still experiencing economic downturn. Coastal erosion is a huge problem. There is an overall lack of capacity. Most cities are small cities, and influx of migrants may be more a stressor than a boon to those cities. What we are trying to understand is this space between opportunity and further harm. So would the influx of population be an opportunity for the Great Lakes region and its cities, both coastal and inland cities, to reframe what growth and rebuild and innovation means, from attracting economic migrants, the creative classes, those with money, education, and resources, and in doing so, rather than further marginalizing current populations through gentrification or making less of an effort to build on the capacity that these communities already have to imagine or envision a future that is more equitable and sustainable, for example. So this whole idea of what constitutes just migration is a huge issue in this scenario, in this context, because it's just migration not only in the way that you enable those who need to move away from where they are right now to do so in conditions of justice and inclusion and equity, but also how where they are going, how the receiving communities on the other side could also benefit from this migration to offset some of the deficits that are already there. So part of the conversation is understanding what are those opportunities. The other part of the conversation is how this is also an opportunity for broadening participation and engagement. So for GLISA, for us, part of the attraction is really understanding how we can set up relationships and research projects that will allow us to understand not only what these visions of the future are, but how diverse they are, and how this in the act of participation of this visioning can help or can further enable communities to stand by what they want, and what would be the way for them to have a voice on those processes. So this project that we are hoping to start soon is both understanding how multi simulation of land use modeling, for instance, participatory modeling, participatory scenario building can help us to understand the diversity of voices and preferences on those communities. I think that is a problem when we talk about communities. We usually think of communities in a very homogeneous way, and we don't know exactly, because we can't engage with every community, how they might differ and what is the net preference on this process across different communities, but also how we can think of means of platforms in which we can dramatically increase the participation of people through computers, through modeling, through crowdsourcing, that would allow us in the cities to plan better for the future. So these are some of our questions. The project is a land use change model that would allow remote connection from people around the Great Lakes. And they would be able to play with scenarios of siting, both housing, urban form, and green infrastructure, for instance, and how that would intersect with climate change impact to simulate different scenarios and different visions of the future. So it's both understanding how we can include people in this process, but also how this inclusion can yield something concrete both for them and for cities on better understand how to realize these opportunities of migration and not be again left out of the conversation or being marginalized again in the way that cities are positioning themselves right now to attract people, migrants from other regions of the US. So this is a conceptual model of the project. I'll be happy to answer questions about it, but it's really trying to understand those processes together. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, let's go to now Malgosia.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, just to check, can you see my slide okay? And do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much. Good evening, everyone. So I will speak briefly about a case study in preparing for flooding in the urban Northeast. And I'm talking about a case study in preparing for flooding rather than managed retreat more specifically, and I'll explain why the case study does have implications for managed retreat. So the urban Northeast is the region that the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, the CCRUN RISA, serves. This is, sorry, just one second. I'm sorry, oh, here we go, okay. The region that CCRUN serves is the one outlined in green on this map. It's the only RISA that it doesn't actually follow state lines and that is focused on urban areas. It's defined by metropolitan counties, and it actually overlaps states that are members of other RISAs. So sort of the defining characteristics of this urban Northeast are diversity and density. There's a range of density from the most densely populated and built environment in the country, which is New York City, to somewhat less dense to smaller towns south and north along the coast. And there is a huge diversity in community profiles in terms of income, race, and so on. In this region, flooding is the main risk that may cause dislocation of populations. And that's both coastal flooding, and the CCRUN RISA is particularly focused on the coast, as well as inland, more rainfall-driven flooding. And the flood-prone areas kind of represent the diversity of the region. In the region as a whole, Hurricane Sandy was a real wake-up call. It accelerated efforts to build resilience to flooding throughout the region. And I should say that the flood risk in the region is sort of the scale of it is somewhat staggering. There are billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that are in the way of flood risks, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. In the acceleration of the kind of resilience efforts to prepare for flooding, there was an understandable focus on making infrastructure, critical infrastructure, more resilient. But there has also been very extensive efforts to prepare communities. So there have been, throughout the region, there have been many neighborhood meetings, town halls, designed to raise awareness in communities about flood risks and actions that residents can take, and to motivate residents to start preparing. By and large, managed retreat has not been integrated into those conversations extensively or in a sort of very systematic or extensive way. Most municipalities are still quite reluctant to talk about managed retreat for a variety of reasons, many of which we've heard about throughout this conference. And New York City is among those municipalities that has been reluctant to talk about managed retreat. Although there is a new interest, there's a recently increasing interest among decision makers that CCRUN has been working with in considering managed retreat as a sort of as a more surgical kind of strategic approach as part of a menu of options to build resilience in coastal areas, for example, by perhaps developing managed retreat programs to address flooding issues in areas that are too expensive to protect, or to preserve land that can then protect other areas behind it. Communities as well, residents in communities, by and large, throughout the region, are not really quite ready to talk about managed retreat, which makes starting those conversations somewhat challenging. There have definitely been managed retreat programs, which CCRUN has not been directly involved with yet, but I'm happy to talk about them more in discussion if there are questions later. One of them, which happened on Staten Island after Hurricane Sandy, I will come back to in a few slides. And these photos are from that buyout program on Staten Island. For this presentation, I would like to focus on a case study that CCRUN is a CCRUN project in New York City. And apologies to those of you who heard my presentation in the afternoon Building Coastal Resilience session when I was talking about this case study. I'll give a brief summary of it here because it does have implications for managed retreat. The question that this project is addressing is what can help urban communities to prepare for flooding? And the motivation for this question is that I was saying that communities are not yet open to the idea of discussing managed retreat by and large, with some exceptions in the region. But beyond that, despite now 9 years worth of neighborhood meetings and town halls, research done by CCRUN, by Bill Selecki and myself through surveys of stakeholders and residents in CCRUN has shown that residents are surprisingly still unaware of future flood risk and of actions that they can take to address that risk, and really are not taking action. So residents are not yet doing anything to prepare for flooding. So this is an issue, sort of that willingness to act is an issue that we need to address before we can make progress on sort of choosing strategies. This project is focusing on in Rockaway. That's an area of New York City. It's this narrow barrier peninsula here, and this map shows the sort of so-called 100-year flood plain for New York City. The blue is the expected flooding in Rockaway. So this is a very micro sort of level project, but I think it has broader implications for the region. So we were aiming to start a conversation on preparing for flooding in Rockaway, and we engaged with residents who are organized, so mainly homeowner groups, civic associations, and we co-produced with leaders of those community groups a series of 3 workshops that we conducted with with 2 different sets of community groups. These workshops had 2 sort of particular features. They focused on what individual homeowners, the flood risk that individual homeowners face, and what individuals can do to prepare for flooding, which may seem odd since preparing for flooding requires sort of collective decision-making, but I'll explain in a minute. And the information that we were co-producing with our community group partners is information that is very place and person specific, like down to the individual homeowner level. And the motivation for this was the hypothesis that one part of the reason that residents are not yet preparing for flooding is that people do not have an understanding of the individual risk that they face from flooding and actions that they can take to address it. And related to, so they don't have an understanding of how it affects them personally in their home, in their family. And related to that, they don't have information that they need to make the kinds of decisions that they would be making, which is, for example, do I want to retrofit my home? Do I want to leave? What is the resilience plan that I want to support if I get involved in some broader process? So we were focusing on providing information really to individual homeowners that, for those who wanted it, showed them their flood risks and benefits and costs of adaptation actions that they could take. And there was surprising variation in this individual level information, even across a narrow, low-lying peninsula like Rockaway, variation that was driven by even small changes in elevation of homes, whether or not homes had basements, and so on. So we're not yet finished with the evaluation of the project. We actually finished the workshops just last week. We're sort of still, the project is ongoing, but we have some preliminary insights based on just the workshop participants, people who participated. It has been, by the participants' own statements, it has been useful for residents to consider these individual risks. Going through that, considering that information has actually changed the way that they think about risk of flooding. So the participants came to us with a sort of interest in learning more about flooding and a concern that New York City wasn't doing more to prepare Rockaway for flooding, but not really any kind of not any sense that they needed to act. going through this information in the workshops, these individual level assessments, greatly increased the sense of urgency, changed the conversation to, we need to act, we need to start addressing this problem now. Participants felt empowered by having a menu of actions before they really had been thinking, well, I can raise my house, but since I don't have enough money to raise my house, there's nothing I can do. They came out thinking about a menu of both individual and collective strategies that they could take. And this was empowering to them to be able to say, what is it that works for me? And what is it that works for my community? That made them more willing to want to take action. And they began to consider, by the second workshop, participants who really were not willing to think about relocating at the beginning were beginning to talk about the decision to relocate. They're not yet ready to participate necessarily in a managed retreat program, but by the third workshop, relocation was definitely an item on the menu of planning that they wanted to consider, that they thought might be necessary. And by considering those individual level risks and benefits and costs of action, they came to the conclusion that they really need to organize beyond their community groups across the peninsula to plan, to participate in planning for flooding and to influence the eventual plan for resilience in Rockaway. So some of the transferable lessons that seem to be emerging from this case study is the community really came to the conclusion that their engagement in planning for resilience is critical if they want to see a plan for resilience that works for them. But what was also really highlighted is that communities have very different capacities to engage in an informed way. So for example, after Hurricane Sandy, there were two communities that got buyouts on Staten Island. In Rockaway, many homeowners were interested in buyouts, but there were very few, and for the most part, they were individual homes, whereas in Staten Island, two communities got bought out, the land got returned to nature to protect the area. So the question arises, why did Staten Island get those buyouts and the interested homeowners in Rockaway did not? And the answer for certainly is complex, and there are many factors, but an important reason must be that the communities in Staten Island were highly organized and they had been lobbying for those buyouts for some time. The communities in Rockaway were not, which raises the question, why were the communities in Rockaway not organized? And again, the answers are complex, but Rockaway is far more diverse than Staten Island. There are communities, there are low-income communities, communities that are racially diverse. Is it more difficult to organize across such communities? Participants in our workshops were saying so, and they were concerned about what does it take to organize across such a diverse and divided area. The communities in the peninsula are quite divided, which suggests that as funding begins to shift from recovery to mitigating risks and preparing for flooding, those resources are needed not only for buying homes or actions that will reduce flood risk, but for building the capacity in communities to actually participate in these processes in an informed way, inform those processes in order to obtain outcomes that work for them. And this has serious implications for equity as well. The equity of outcomes in Rockaway will depend very much on how the low-income, racially diverse communities are able to participate in these processes. And the other element that came across very clearly is the need for scientific information that is specific to residents, to the decisions that residents have to make. CCRUN is very much involved, as are all the RISAs, in providing scientific information that is specific to stakeholders' decisions, but we don't always go down all the way to the level of residents and the kind of scientific information that they need. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Malgosia. Thank you to all four of our speakers. So we have queued up a couple of questions, and then we'll go to audience questions. So this is one, for any of our six panelists, really, the four we heard from, but also Laura Brewington, PI for Pacific RISA. Please feel free to jump in too, and Anna Lopresti from CCRUN as well for any of these questions. Okay, so first one, how can the RISA network facilitate integrated planning on managed retreat? And we certainly, heard some specific examples, but does anyone want to sort of opine in a broader sense about how the network could integrate, maybe working across RISAs, for example, to engage more on planning for managed retreat?
I can give a quick plug on that, Radley. And that would mostly be to mention that we are trying to start this conversation, as you know, by having a whole bunch of county representatives from different departments from the County of Kauai present at this, or Zoom present at this conference for the next couple of days, hoping to really start some conversation. So we were able to fund the registration for about 40 people from the county. And really, they are working on these questions already and are deep in the weeds of the policies and the plans and the timelines. But being able to attend this type of conference, I think, is a way for to just better start the cross-pollination of ideas around managed retreat and relocation, and different strategies are being used. As we saw, there are so many very specific community scale projects that are going on. They're all going to have very different needs and policies and research and findings, but being connected to people, I think is a good start. And hopefully that's going to start happening here.
Absolutely. Any other comments on that question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I have 2 points. Just piggybacking on what Vicky said. I think even in addition to the conference, I mean, the RISA network just serves as a fantastic communication channel for researchers and practitioners across the country to exchange ideas about what worked where and how can it be transferable somewhere else. It's really quite irreplaceable in that way. And the second thing is that it serves as a potential quote unquote laboratory in which we can test approaches under very different conditions and learn how they work under different conditions, to learn how they can be adopted else in places other than where they were tested.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's go to another question now. How can environmental justice be better integrated into relocation efforts at the local, regional, and inter-regional scales? Kind of, sort of the core question in some ways of this entire conference, but consistent with the idea that RISAs have some unique experience and some unique scales. Love to hear from anyone about ways that environmental justice could be better integrated into relocation efforts across scales, let's say, including regional and inter-regional. Comments?
Yeah, one of the talks that I was really impressed with earlier today was actually in session 2C on finance and insurance. Marco Tedesco from Columbia presented on his group's work on evidence of climate gentrification in Florida. And they compiled an index made up of multiple indices of social vulnerability, rental price increases over time, and various other equity indicators that both highlighted where climate impacts are expected to happen at the coast and a push to move more inland, and that the people in the places that are being displaced inland tend to come from these inequitable situations already. And so compiling this this type of index and rendering it in a spatial way, I think, is a really powerful tool. It's something that the Pacific RISA program is looking toward in some of our future research. And I think a lot of places are trying to implement it because it's got real uptake from policymakers. And one thing that I like about the Columbia tool that Marco and others built is that it uses publicly available information. So there is no lack of access to that data. It's all out there. So that's a great example.
I was just going to add the point you just made, and transparent also about how the data is developed in addition to sharing it. That's the kind of thing that the RISAs can do well in their sort of role of brokers and giving sort of context to information as trusted sources. Any other comments on this question about sort of justice dimensions?
I think another way is really, how we can include more people in this discussion. We have those networks, and I think that data in projects are very important because they will show something, and evidence-based is everything, if we want to get things done, especially at the policy level. But at the ground level as well, I think that we assume, I think that Malgosia's example is very good. You assume the communities are at the same level of knowledge, that they have the same interests, and even communities that sometimes are very similar to each other. Even frontline communities or marginalized communities, we assume they are thinking about the future the same way and that they have the same interests. And I think because we have this network, we need to understand better what those preferences are. If they are going to be affected or if they are moving. I think it's, I think it was Danielle's presentation that showed that even very, very small communities, people disagree within those very, very small communities about things that are very basic about how they want to live their lives and what the future will be. So mobilizing our resources and our relationships to better understand that and broaden our networks on that way, I think it's something that we can do. We have done it well and we can do better.
Thanks. Any other comments on this question? Okay, let's move at least for a while now to some questions from the audience. So we have a question from Carly Lovis. Because of COVID, we're already seeing a huge issue with the housing market as a consequence of people leaving urban environments. How can we ensure that climate refugees within the US won't be priced out of economic hotspots? Great question. Anybody?
I think this is already happening. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to get much worse. It's already happening because of COVID, and even reconstruction in a lot of big cities. You see this in Detroit already. That the reinvigoration of the city, which is very welcome, is already displacing people tremendously. So it's not going to get better if it doesn't become an agenda item, rather than things that we talk about, but we actually don't do anything about it.
I might also just note that we're seeing something a little more complex in Hawaii too. We've actually, I think in 2020, we lost population, about 16,000 people migrated away from the state. But at the same time, people who are staying are being priced out of existing housing, and there's a severe affordable housing shortage. So we're seeing different populations moving in and out, and the state has not addressed that yet. So this is I'm not sure if this is something that needs to be elevated to almost a federal scale in order to be able to address these kind of interstate movements of people. But it's definitely being experienced differently in around the United States, and is a huge issue.
I'll just say briefly, there are interesting interactions between different push and pull forces, right? I mean, COVID, in New York City, COVID pushed a lot of people out of the city, which actually lowered rents in Manhattan, potentially making room for people to move in from the coast, making it a bit more, probably not affordable enough. But although I'm not sure that anybody's been taking advantage of that opportunity, but that doesn't make a housing policy, that kind of interaction between stresses. It really, there needs to be a housing policy to address these issues, and we don't have one.
Yeah, including the idea at the federal scale is an interesting idea. Other comments on this point?
Yeah, I'll just say, similar to what Victoria mentioned about Hawaii, Alaska deals more with out migration than an influx of people. But we're finding that a lot of that out migration is due to a lack of economic opportunity in what has traditionally been a resource-based economy. So what we are trying to think about is what are economic opportunities within climate adaptation through capacity building, and how can we incentivize more people to stay?
Okay, great. We had an anonymous question. Across regions, disasters, whether natural, economic, or other, seem to create windows of opportunity for considering retreat. Do the panelists today have any lessons about how to implement retreat pre-disaster or disconnected from disasters, I guess, independent of disasters? Any thoughts? And feel free to emphasize any points you may have heard throughout the conference so far, as this has been touched on in other sessions too, I know.
I want to make two quick points, actually. First, back to one of the sessions earlier today, session 2C, I think it was, Swenja Struminsky really considered this question of how to finance things like pre-disaster planning for relocation or for mitigation or for resilience. And just she really emphasized the cost of doing nothing are so much greater than the cost of trying to plan ahead. And kind of along that line, I want to put Malgosia in the hot seat because her presentation earlier today on enabling homeowners to adapt to coastal flooding risks in Rockaway, I thought was a great example of exactly this question of, like, we know that there's a risk. How do we inform people and our constituents, and how do we encourage them to take action?
Thanks, Laura. And in the interest of, at the risk of being self-serving, I was going to say that the example that I gave from Rockaway is divorced from disaster, if you want. I mean, it's 9 years since Sandy, and not much has happened other than a lot of neighborhood meetings, which apparently didn't change the thinking of most residents. So this is an example that it's early days in this project. The communities are taking first steps, but there are initial indicators that you can change minds and motivate people to act independently of a disaster, although certainly having had the experience of a disaster probably is helping. But maybe the critical point from that is what seems to be critical in that example is really concrete, person-specific information is what seems to be changing minds.
People talking about their experiences.
No, us providing information to people about literally what is the flood risk and benefits and costs of actions that they can take for their home, particular home at the elevation that their home is, and depending on whether or not they have a basement. Sorry, I had another point to make, but it just escaped me.
Okay.
I'll let others go.
I wanted to touch on something that, so we've been doing some peer-to-peer conversations with different counties in Hawaii. And one of the kind of best practices that came out of one of the discussions was we discussed how to best implement some of these conversations and policies before a disaster actually hits, or before it's, you're reacting rather than planning. And so one of the best practices that was identified was that every agency, every city, every county has many existing plans in various forms of, they're updated every X or Y years. There are already resources that go into them, and they lay out a lot of related things. So to build onto existing plans and add sections where they fit in and use those timelines of the plans being updated to work in this new information. And so like some of the other speakers brought up, identify specific actions for stakeholders to rally behind. This is both important in the individual level and at that larger policy scale. So there's the collective and the individual. That was identified as a best practice. Use an inclusive and iterative process to identify strategies and cross-classify your responsibilities and priorities across the different departments. And if you're working with different communities as well. So there was also the idea to identify metrics to quantify the progress in each idea that you're priority that you're talking about. But I think the take home was to build on the plethora of existing plans and timelines to grow those out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another question that just came in. Can you collectively imagine what a national communication or engagement strategy on retreat might look like? It seems to take so much time to get going, but we're living on the bottom end of an exponential curve. So, maybe thinking of RISA experiences or otherwise, what might a national communication or engagement strategy on retreat look like? Difficult questions.
I'll venture to say that there are different pieces of this problem need to be addressed at different levels. There are sort of policy issues with retreat that really should be addressed at the national level, such as designing retreat policies that actually address equity issues, that don't favor wealthy communities, that sort of develop consensus around what are the equity goals that we're trying to achieve and how are we going to get there. And financing mechanisms that support equitable retreat. Those seem to be sort of national level challenges. The communication and engagement, I feel that there is no substitute for starting that in communities at the lowest levels. And my hope is, one of the things that I'm trying to learn in my project as well, is that these need more of a catalyst than a broad engagement strategy. So if you start with community leaders, the process may take on a life of its own in different communities. Communities may be able to own that process and carry it on by themselves with appropriate support from higher levels. And then that becomes city, state, national policy, but not necessarily, the research projects or academics or even nonprofits don't necessarily have to go out and engage every resident.
Yeah. Okay. Staying with you, Malgosia, I think this is a really important comment and question really for the whole group. Dorothy followed up saying, isn't it a cop-out to go along with the idea that it's just harder to organize heterogeneous communities with different races? If so, we must be examples of even treatment and yes, work twice as hard. I think that's something we'd all agree with. Speaking for the group, I don't know if people have comments about that, but maybe this next piece, the question, is also really worth taking up. The suggestion that maybe a smarter approach is to find a helper from each group. So anyone have any comments about that sort of ways to engage communities and taking really active roles and to sort of ways that we can work with existing institutions and structures in some of these communities?
And so I'll just jump in really quickly and then I'll let others talk. That I did bring this point up. It wasn't by way of going along with it. I think the example in Rockaway is really a set of community groups that really want to fight against that trend. And it's precisely along the ways that you're suggesting here, Dorothy, that there are groups that represent different communities. Unfortunately, the groups are kind of segregated by community, but they're really their commitment coming out of these workshops was to try to organize with each other to really connect these different communities and work across these differences. It remains to be seen how successful they'll be, but I'll report back with any lessons learned.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments about maybe ways to engage with leaders within communities or existing kind of structures, maybe especially that can sort of help integrate across any sort of challenges posed by heterogeneity?
I would just say, especially in the Pacific, where the diversity is pretty great, and you have so many different communities from so many different parts of the region with multiple different languages, yes, it's a huge challenge to feel like you can even grasp the landscape of different people's experiences. But there are a lot of really effective strategies to reach communities and to reach their members through churches and through health organizations by translating your materials into multiple languages. So, there's, at least for the Pacific, we've had, I think, a lot of effective and a lot of strategies that have helped us learn how to better reach communities. And I also, I think at least in the region where we work, people across all different walks of life and parts of the region are very, very vocal about the impacts of climate change and the concerns and the desires that they have for their futures and their homes. And so there is already, I think, a real willingness to engage. It's just kind of finding the right pathways.
Okay, excellent. Looks like maybe one final question just came in from Caitlin. Has or will infrastructure concerns about, for example, septic systems, fire hydrants eroding, road erosion, as examples, be larger drivers of what communities do than concerns about individual houses? Or is it housing and businesses flooding that are the main concerns? So maybe sort of individual local scale versus larger infrastructure systems, which could, of course, be included to consider things like hospitals and such. Anyone want to weigh in on those sort of different scales as drivers for retreat and as sort of distinct considerations that we have to think about when thinking about retreat? Maybe actually, can I sort of call you out, Danielle, maybe to start us out if you have some thoughts on this across scales, and then turn to others in our closing minute or two on this question.
Yeah, I'm kind of mulling over that question because not all of the communities that are pursuing relocation or managed retreat have piped sewage systems or fire hydrants or non-gravel paved roads. I am thinking about the project that ACAP is working on with LSU and the rural water and wastewater managers in both Alaska and Louisiana. And one thing that we think is maybe ripe for some cross-regional learning is that in Louisiana and Texas, they have been experiencing these recent cold snaps that have just really caught water managers off guard. And I don't want to speak for them, but what I'm hearing from the researchers is that they're, because they're perceived as these sort of one-off events, there's not a strong desire among managers to really learn more about them. Whereas in Alaska, our water and wastewater managers are well attuned to cold snaps and how to keep their systems running. So we're thinking about what sort of lessons we can exchange across regions. But primarily, getting back to that question, these smaller coastal communities mostly just have houses and limited infrastructure. So that's the focus on the houses. Usually there's what's called a washateria, that's kind of a community center where people can wash their clothes, and the school. Those are usually the main hubs in a community.
Okay, thanks. Got time for maybe one more person to jump in on this question, and then we should probably wrap. Anybody, anything to say on it?
Well, I will if no one else does. I mean, in Rockaway, it was the houses, individual houses were kind of the hook, the first thing you had to start talking about for people to get interested and relate the problem of flooding to their own situation, start getting personally engaged in it. As soon as they started getting personally engaged, their focus broadened and they started worrying about public infrastructure, services, what will the entire neighborhood and the community look like, which led them to the idea we need both individual and collective action, and we need to organize this kind of.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I see we're at time. Want to be mindful of folks' time. Thank you all for a great discussion. Really appreciated hearing all these perspectives. Thanks to those who sent in questions, and special thanks to the program office at NOAA and at RISA for enabling us to explore these issues. And as Malgosia, I think, put it well, so do these sort of shared experiments and shared learning around challenging and emerging issues like this that require sort of all aspects of society to engage around as we think about more climate resilient and in other ways better futures. So thanks to everyone, and with that, I think we can close for the evening or afternoon, as the case may be. Thanks again to the speakers. All right.